let's start with part one, broken this kind of into three parts with cannabis marketplace realities. Let's just briefly go over what the heck is cannabis, what's the historical use, and things like, are marijuana and hemp the same or different? And just a reminder, unless I say otherwise, I'm speaking of this from like a US context. So there are certain definitions and legal ramifications that I've recognized are unique to the US marketplace. So that's our scope. Just to start with, cannabis as a plant, right? The cannabis is a genus of the plant, Cannabis sativa, sativa being the species. And it's also an umbrella term that includes marijuana and hemp. Marijuana and hemp are both derived from the same plant, but the only difference is the legal definition carved out based on the Controlled Substance Act and the Agricultural Improvement Act, more commonly known as the Farm Bill of 2018, where they separated marijuana being greater than 0.3% delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis, which is still considered a Schedule I and federally illegal drug. And then your hemp, which is less than 0.3% of delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis. We won't go into the nuances of the different deltas, alphabet soup, and the different tetrahydrocannabinols or THC, but I'm sure many of you are aware that that is a challenge across many marketplaces today. Cannabis is a really complex plant, not unlike most plants, whether it's an herbal medicine, whether it's just a natural plant you grow in your garden for ornamental or for edible purposes. As you look really closely here, you'll see that there's many different parts of the plant and cannabinoids where you've got THC, CBD, THCV, and that kind of pink hue spectrum. It's a small percentage of the entire plant overall. You've got terpenoids, sesquiterpenes, monoterpenes, flavonoids, the waxes, right? Think of just, a waxy substance, lignin, cellulose. The cannabinoids are predominantly responsible for providing those physiological effects, with THC being, impairing and intoxicating, and psychotropic. Whereas, terpenoids are commonly, create the smell and aroma. Folks that like a good, hazy IPA, a good beer with a lot of hops. Hops are actually in the same family as the cannabis plant. Again, you've got genus, family, genus, and then species. So you've got hops that are also in the same family, and a lot of the terpenoids that you'll find in cannabis are also found in hops. You've got, the 5 most common terpenes, which I bring this up because it's important, in my opinion, that which is actually confirmed by both U.S. Pharmacopoeia's Cannabis Expert Panel and ASTM International's Consensus Committee on Developing Standards, that especially for medical uses, we should be at a minimum reporting the concentration of the 5 most common terpenoids or terpenes in these products, because they are found in the highest and consistent concentration and are believed to have the most promise for modulating therapeutic effects in the cannabinoid products. Just a brief history of cannabis as a medicine in the US, if you aren't familiar. Cannabis has been used, there's been documented reports of it for, I believe, about 5,000 years, going back to China, India, and the Middle East. And, specifically in the US, from 1850 until 1942, there was a monograph in the US Pharmacopoeia for cannabis indica that was an extract in alcohol that was used to treat all sorts of ailments, labor pains, nausea, rheumatism, and others. And it was really common in patent medicines until about 1906. Around 1937, or not around, but 1937, the Marijuana Act was passed, which made it illegal to possess or sell except for medical use, which was taxed at an extremely high rate. And here's an example of the special tax stamp, which, for various related reasons, led to about 5 years later, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, which is essentially the premier authority in global medicines. They have legal binding ramifications for pharmaceutical drugs in 40 countries with their monographs, including, of course, the United States, and they're 200 years old. So they are a, strong authority in medicines historically. So it's interesting to note that this was in the Pharmacopoeia for about 90 years. And I'll share a bit later about some of the great work that USP has been doing in this space since. You may or may not be familiar with the current patchwork landscape within the United States. We've got something like approximately 38 to 40 programs, depending on how you count them, that have some sort of medical or adult use cannabis. And this comes courtesy of the National Conference on State Legislatures, and it's already out of date because this was in April. And as of yesterday in Minnesota, the governor just signed the bill in Minnesota, and I believe it was earlier this month or late in April that Delaware also passed an adult use program. So we've now gone up to 21 states with adult and medical use regulated programs, and 2 less states that are medical only. This is kind of changing by the day. And, despite coming from the same plant, right, back to cannabis, marijuana, or hemp, there's many different product types. And I'll be honest, I've typically had kind of a negative reaction to, maybe call it the anti-cannabis groups that, have used, this isn't your father's or grandfather's weed. But the reality is, this is pretty true and important when we get into the GMP sector. You've got all sorts of different, smokable cannabis products. You've got concentrates, right, where you're doing different extraction methods, natural processing, solvent processing. And, just a note, the processes to create this is not that uncommon. In the food industry, you think about how decaffeinated coffee is made. There's a lot of similarities there, and a lot of, herbal extracts, tinctures that you might see at a wellness store. You've got vape cartridges. Probably the most similar parallel is, e-liquids for, nicotine. There is a big chemical difference, which causes a lot of complications in terms of how we evaluate and test and, evaluate the performance of them. And then, of course, you've got edibles. And one thing that, we won't get into today, but I think is really important to note is that we're seeing these, fast-acting edibles or gummies. And what is that, or even beverages? And fast acting being not the typical 1 to 2 hours that it takes for your body to metabolize and convert the delta 9 THC compound into something that's bioavailable for your body to actually metabolize and cause those physiological effects. But that means that we're adding in other minor chemicals. I think food science, if anybody is familiar with that side, where we're doing some unique food chemistry here. And are we thinking about the safety impacts of that and how that may impact, labeling and dosage limits? There's a whole can of worms that our innovative industry is pushing the boundaries of, and we're, I would say, as public health safety professionals are, doing a decent job at keeping up, but we're really struggling, and there's a lot more resources that are needed. And then, of course, you've got your tinctures, sublinguals, and syrups, which, folks that come from the pharma world will typically look at these and say, wait, you're putting them in oil? Like, this is usually in like an alcohol extract or alcohol medium. And so there's one thing the cannabis industry is not short on is coming up with creative ways to try to make these products very unique. And then, of course, we've got topicals, bath bombs, transdermals, patches, and, finally, and I put this kind of in semi-order of like risk with suppositories, inhalers, and nasal sprays. These are products that are directly crossing the blood-brain barrier immediately and have different risk profiles. There's a big difference between eating an apple and, inhaling an extract of an apple. And that's what these product form factors are creating opportunities for, which again come with very different risks based on the route of administration or consumption, right? So think about it, are we putting it on our bodies, like a cosmetic cream? Are we eating it, ingesting it? Are we inhaling it into our lungs, like a nebulizer or a vape cartridge? Or are we actually, putting it in other, like in our nose, which has different implications and risks. Depending on where you live, your experience will vary greatly, right? So both medical stores here, California, looks very different than when you walk into a Minnesota dispensary or a medical cannabis outlet. And that's just one small but important example of the many differences you'll see between state by state marketplaces. we've seen a lot in the industry. There's a lot of movement, right? Just like I showed, the National Conference on State Legislatures, we've had a major change. We've had 2 more states have add adult use marketplaces in just the last 30, 40 days. Back in the fall, you may or may not be familiar with President Biden's statement on marijuana reform, which authorized the DEA and FDA to start conducting their review through what's known as an 8-factor analysis that the FDA or Health and Human Services is leading to reevaluate the scheduling of cannabis. There's been, various DOJ through the Drug Enforcement Administration on these minor cannabinoids that, I'd mentioned we wouldn't go into detail on, with, say, Delta 8 THC or THCO, which is also known as THC acetate. And you've even got, the wine and alcohol industry getting much more engaged politically and advocating and lobbying for, cannabis, let alone adult use versus medical use. And one question that I always like to ask folks, kind of rhetorically, because there's just many different answers / no standardized answers, of what is the difference between medical cannabis and adult use cannabis. There's probably a reason, a logical delineation of what there should be, but in most marketplaces, you can't find a common thread there, besides perhaps taxes. What have been the impacts of the lack of federal regulation and state regulation frameworks? This patchwork, we've had tons of recalls. And some states call them public health and safety bulletins. Some are actually mandatory recalls. Some states don't even have recall programs. So it's, again, all over the place. And personally, I find it scary to know that there are states and businesses, even within these states, that are required to have the programs that don't have a basic recall plan in place. This is, basic business continuity, risk management, because you want to be prepared for a worst case scenario, especially when it can impact the hundreds to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of consumers. We've got, I don't think any state has been void of recalls. This is, and internationally, right? This is an example of a news article in Quebec in 22. We've had other issues, right? Employee safety issues. There's been employee deaths. There's been allergies that have been discovered that are associated with just handling the cannabis product. I've heard, anecdotal reports, and there are some that have been documented in the OSHA database, where you can actually search essentially all violations or infractions and reports of cannabis workers developing rashes and other allergies because of their proximity and to handling the product. And then we're seeing these other really concerning things where, with some products in certain states where there is not a medical or adult use marketplace, but through the Agricultural Improvement Act or Farm Bill's perceived loopholes, there's products containing THC less than 0.3% on a dry weight basis in grocery stores, in gas stations. And there's a bus driver in New England last year that was found passed out on the side of the road, driving a bunch of people home from a casino that has a sweet tooth, and was munching on gummies that happen to have THC. Again, think about the effects of the fast acting or non-fast acting edibles and the dosing there. By the time you've realized that you consumed 50 milligrams of THC, let's say, or more, it's a bit too late. You're feeling these effects 1 to 2 hours later. And that's a serious concern for both public health at a broad scale and individual consumers. There's kind of a lot of many common recalls or triggers for recalls. And, not to just paint a black picture on the cannabis industry, every industry has recalls. We can see historical recalls, peanuts, right? Jif and peanut butter and salmonella. There's been some really famous, and historical recalls that have had significant impacts on the public for the last really century, and even before that. History of unapproved ingredients being put into products, adulteration, which is a FDA definition, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons. And again, cannabis is not void of it, but it's being prepared and doing your best to mitigate the potential for an incident that could require recall that I see the cannabis industry has been very slow to grasp on.